What's up, everybody? Tom here, back again with another video. And what we're going to talk about today is we're going to do a continuation on the last video that I did, which was called How to Vote and Why in the 2018 midterms. And in that video, I made the argument that you should vote for progressive candidates if they actually stand a chance of beating the Republicans. And in lieu of an option like that, you should really just vote for Democrats across the board instead of Republicans. And I backed that argument up by saying that the reason for it is that currently Republicans control the government, and we need to try to get some of that control out of the hands of the Republicans because they have really bad policies on things like the environment and social issues. Okay? Now, let me preface everything again with the disclaimer that I'm not a fan of the Democratic Party as a whole. I think there's some good people and some bad people in it, but they are at least a lot better on a few key issues compared to the Republicans, namely the environment and social issues. But I want to go into a little bit more detail about what it means that the Republicans control the government. And we're just going to do a little bit of high school civics. Okay, I'm not like a expert political scientist or anything, but there's some basic stuff that I think just bears hammering out. So there's three branches of government in America. There's the executive branch, there's the legislative branch, and there is the judicial branch. So there's three branches. The reason that the founding fathers put three branches of government into the Constitution is so that each branch can check the other one to make sure that no one entity has too much power to avoid things like dictatorship and absolute rule. So the idea is that if you have three different branches, each with their own powers and responsibilities and what's the word I'm looking for? And interests, that the two branches can always keep the third branch from getting out of hand. So what are the three branches? Executive, legislative, and judicial. The executive branch is easy. This is essentially just the president. He's the executive of the country. He's the one that sort of gets the final say and leads the country. The first executive was, of course, George Washington, who was the commander of the Revolutionary Army in the Revolutionary War. Then after that, we had John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, yada, 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 yada. And the president has a few like really nice things that he can do. One is the executive order, which just basically means that that's a piece of paper that he signs and he says, this is now going to happen. And then that happens. So that's a big piece of power that they have right there. It was never used as prolifically as it is now. As time goes on, presidents have used the executive order much more liberally. And I don't mean liberal as in liberal or conservative, just liberally as in like they've been using it a lot. And every president uses it more than the one before them. And I think a big part of that is that these presidents make promises on the campaign trail that they can't really get past without those. They also have veto power, which means that if Congress passes a bill or something, the president can say, you know what, I don't like that bill. I'm going to just take it off the table. It's not going to happen. Presidential pardons, they can essentially protect any person from facing legal consequences that they want. Donald Trump has famously said that he can pardon himself if he's convicted of a crime. Which raises some interesting constitutional questions. So that's the executive branch. The president has a lot of power That's obvious. Everybody knows that. But there's two other branches. The second one I want to talk about is the legislative branch. Okay, so this is the Congress, essentially. It's the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives are folks who are elected by the people in their states. And the number of seats for each state in the House of Representatives is essentially based on the population of that state. So the more population you have, the more representatives you have in the House of Representatives. And then another part of the legislative branch is the Senate. Now, the Senate has 2 senators per state, regardless of population. And this was part of a compromise. I forget what it was called. It might be the Great Compromise. I'm not sure. During the when they were writing the Constitution, that essentially said, okay, look, the big states, or the states with large populations, want to have that representative in the government, but the states with low populations don't want to have their interests completely pushed aside by just like a few big cities. So you have the Senate, which is just flat, 2 senators per state, done. And then you have the House of Representatives, which is proportional to the population. And the legislative branch is where laws are created and written out, and then these bills get voted on and then eventually passed. These are the people that are supposed to vote on going to war. Going to war is supposed to be up to Congress. That's an important thing. Recently, Congress hasn't been wanting to take that responsibility, but they're supposed to, according to the Constitution. And it's essentially just come down to the president. That's a big problem in and of itself. One problem that we have right now is that the Congress doesn't really want to accept the responsibility that they're supposed to have, and they're shirking the responsibility over to the president, which gives the president much more power, because it means that there's not now this balance of powers. It means that some of the things that the Congress is supposed to do to prevent the president from getting too powerful, they're not doing, and they're just having the president do it. So it's another power that the president has, and it's one power that the Congress is not taking advantage of. Congressmen and senators, the legislative branch, are voted on every 2 years. This was meant to sort of allow this branch of government to really follow the needs and whims of the people. These are supposed to be the sort of closest anagram or analogy to the actual people that elected them, because theoretically the turnover is high, but there's no term limits. But at any time, every 2 years, somebody can get voted out and replaced with somebody else, compared to the president, which is every 4 years, and the judicial system, which is actually lifetime appointments. So this is the Supreme Court and the various district courts across the country. The judicial branch is the branch of the government in which is essentially courts. And it's judges that make rulings on things based on their interpretation of the Constitution. And judicial appointments are lifetime. The most famous court in America, and arguably the most influential, is the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is supposed to be filled by people who take an objective look at the Constitution when these cases come to them, and then they're supposed to rule on how these cases should be handled. So what happens is something will happen to somebody or some company or something in the country, and there will be a lawsuit, and it's going to go up the district courts and eventually land in the Supreme Court, which will then rule on it. And the power of the Supreme Court has also been increased recently as well, because they've increasingly started to make rules on cases that end up becoming the law of the land. Which, you know, you say what you want about it. It got gay marriage. That's good. But the real problem with the Supreme Court is that it is increasingly becoming less about objectively studying the Constitution and trying to see what the Constitution says on matters, and it's more becoming just a partisan thing. So the Democratic judges will predictably rule in a certain way, and the Republican judges will predictably rule in a certain way. And it means that it's not so much about following the Constitution anymore, and more about following, you know, each individual justice's political whims. And the real scary thing now is that Kennedy, who's the Supreme Court justice who retired recently, was usually a swing vote. He was a Republican, but on social stuff, he would often vote with the Democratic judges, and that's how we got things like the legalization of gay marriage nationwide. What happened, though, is that Brett Kavanaugh, who's the person who replaced him, is actually very partisan and probably going to vote in lockstep with the Republicans most of the time, which spells bad news for things such as women's rights, LGBT rights, minority voting rights, these kinds of things. Not to mention, Kavanaugh is a big defender of executive power. So he's been on record not saying that the president doesn't have the right to pardon himself of a crime. And he's in favor of warrantless searches by the NSA and the FBI of people. So really, he's bad news. But okay, so here's the whole point of the video. That's a sort of a brief rundown on the three different branches of government. Very, very, very brief. You could have a 1,000-hour video on each branch, and you'd still just be scratching the surface of all the nuances here. But that's just a brief overview. You have the executive branch, the president. You have the legislative branch, the Congress. And you have the judicial branch, the Supreme Court. And these different branches are supposed to sort of control their own areas so that no one branch can become too powerful. But what happens if all three branches have the same ideas, right? And they all want the same things to be promoted? Well, that's what just happened with the nomination of and the passing through of Brett Kavanaugh in the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court is firmly conservative, as well as we have a firmly conservative House of Representatives and Senate in the legislative branch, and obviously we have a very Republican partisan man in the executive branch in Donald Trump. And they're all going to agree on certain things, such as immigration, women's rights, minority rights, LGBT, these kinds of things. So what we have now is a situation where all three branches have the same interests, which means that there's no such thing as a balance of powers anymore. They all want the same things. They're all going to enable each other to do the things that they want, okay? And this is why it's so important to vote in the midterm elections, because what is likely to happen if Democrats go out and vote, but it's likely to not happen if Democrats don't go out and vote, is that the House of Representatives can be flipped to a Democratic majority, which would at least give some Democrats some power and some say in the situation right now. So that's why what you need to do is get out there and vote on November 9th for, say it with me, Democrats. And if there's a viable progressive, vote for that person.